Hi everybody, this is Anjanette from AJ's Personal Touch. How you doing? I am back finally reading Anna Karenina. While I was sick, I didn't feel up to it, and I finally feel up to being able to read and read it out loud. But I've been missing it. I've been waiting to see what happens. Continuing on with the story, we are in book 3, chapter 11. I'm not sure how many chapters I'm going to get through because there's quite a few of them. Normally, I only do, like 4 chapters at the most. But this time, I'm not sure. I'll try not to go over half an hour. So we'll see what we can get with that. Chapter 11. In the middle of July, the elder of the village on Levin's sister's estate, about 15 miles from Pokrovskoe, came to Levin to report on how things were going there and on the hay. The chief source of income on his sister's estate was from the riverside meadows. In former years, the hay had been bought by the peasants for 20 rubles the 3 acres. When Levin took over management of the estate, he thought on examining the grasslands that they were worth more, and he fixed the price at 25 rubles the 3 acres. The peasants would not give that price, and as Levin suspected, kept off other purchasers. Then Levin had driven over himself and arranged to have the grass cut, partly by hired labor, partly at a payment of a certain proportion of the crop. His own peasants put every hindrance they could in the way of this new arrangement, but it was carried out, and the first year the meadows had yielded a profit almost double. The previous year, which was the 3rd year, the peasants had maintained the same opposition to the arrangement, and the hay had been cut on the same system. This year the peasants were doing all the mowing for a third of the hay crop, and the village elder had come now to announce that the hay had been cut, and that, fearing rain, they had invited the counting house clerk over, had divided the crop in the presents, and had raked together 11 stacks as the owner's share. From the vague answers to his questions how much hay had been cut on the principal meadow, from the hurry of the village elder who had made the division, not asking leave, from the whole tone of the peasant, Levin perceived that there was something wrong in the division of the hay, and made up his mind to drive over himself to look into the matter. Arriving for dinner at the village, and leaving his horse at the cottage of an old friend of his, the husband of his brother's wet nurse, Levin went to see the old man in his bee house, wanting to find out from him the truth about the hay. Parmenich, a talkative, comely old man, gave Levin a very warm welcome, showed him all he was doing, told him everything about his bees and the swarms of that year, but gave vague and unwilling answers to Levin's inquiries about the mowing. This confirmed Levin still more in his suspicions. He went to the hayfields and examined the stacks. The haystacks could not possibly contain 50 wagon loads each, and to convict the peasants, Levin ordered the wagons that had carried the hay to be brought up directly, to lift one stack and carry it into the barn. There turned out to be only 32 loads in the stack. In spite of the village elder's assertions about the compressibility of hay, and its having settled down in the stacks, and his swearing that everything had been done in the fear of God, Levin stuck to his point that the hay had been divided without his orders, and that therefore he would not accept the hay as 50 loads to a stack. After a prolonged dispute, the matter was decided by the peasants taking these 11 stacks, reckoning them as 50 loads each. The arrangement and the hay had been divided. Levin, entrusting the superintendence of the rest to the counting-house clerk, sat down on a haycock marked off by a stake of willow and looked admiringly at the meadow swarming with peasants. In front of him, in the bend of the river beyond the marsh, moved a bright-colored line of peasant women, and the scattered hay was being rapidly formed into gray winding rows over the pale gray stubble. After the women came the men with pitchforks, and from the gray rows there were growing up broad, high, soft haycocks. To the left, carts were rumbling over the meadow that had been already cleared, and one after another, the haycocks vanished, flung up in huge forkfuls, and in their place there were rising heavy cartloads of fragrant hay hanging over the horses' hindquarters. "What weather for haying! What hay it'll be!" said an old man squatting down beside Levin. "It's tea, not hay. It's like scattering grain to the ducks, the way they pick it up," he added, pointing to the growing haycocks. "Since dinner time they've carried a good half of it." Sorry about that. I had to pause for a minute. The cat was on top of my papers that I had sitting here, and she was going to make a really loud noise. So I had to intervene. Let me see, where was I? Okay, yeah. Since dinner time, they've carried a good half of it. "The last load, eh?" he shouted to a young peasant who drove by, standing in the front of an empty cart, shaking the cord reins. "The last, Dad," the lad shouted back, pulling in the horse and smiling. He looked round at the bright, rosy-cheeked peasant girl, who sat in the cart smiling too, and drove on. "Who's that? Your son?" asked Levin. "My baby," said the old man, with a tender smile. "What a fine fellow! The lad's all right. Married already?" "Yes, it's 2 years last St. Philip's Day." "Any children?" "Children indeed! Why, for over a year he was innocent as a babe himself, and bashful too," answered the old man. "Well, the hay, it's as fragrant as tea," he repeated, wishing to change the subject. Levin looked more attentively at Ivan Parmenov and his wife. They were loading a haycock onto the cart not far from him. Ivan Parmenov was standing on the cart, laying in place and stamping down the huge bundles of hay, which the pretty young wife deftly handed up to him, at first in armfuls and then on the pitchfork. The young wife worked easily, merrily, and dexterously. The close-packed the The close-packed hay did not once break away off her fork. First she gathered it together, stuck the fork into it, then with a rapid, supple movement leaned the whole weight of her body on it, and at once, with the bend of her back and under the red belt, she drew herself up, and arching her full bosom under the white smock with a smart turn, swung the fork in her arms, and flung the bundle of hay high onto the cart. Ivan, obviously doing his best to save her every minute of unnecessary labor, made haste, opening his arms to clutch the bundle and lay it on the cart. As she raked together what was left of the hay, the young wife shook off the bits of hay that had fallen on her neck, and straightening the red kerchief that had dropped forward over her white brow, not browned like her face by the sun, she crept under the cart to tie up the load. Ivan directed her how to fasten the cord to the cross piece, and at something she said, he laughed aloud. In the expressions of both faces was to be seen vigorous, young, freshly awakened love. Chapter 12. The load was tied on. Ivan jumped down and took the quiet, sleek horse by the bridle. The young wife flung the rake up on the load, and with a bold step, swinging her arms, she went to join the women, who were forming a ring for the haymakers' dance. Ivan drove off to the road and fell into line with the other loaded carts. The peasant women, with their rakes on their shoulders, gay with bright flowers, and chattering with ringing, merry voices, walked behind the hay cart. One with wild, untrained female voice broke into a song and sang it alone. Through a verse, and the same verse was taken up and repeated by half a hundred strong, healthy voices, all of sorts, coarse and fine, singing in unison. The women, all singing, began to come close to Levin, and he felt as though a storm were swooping down upon him with the thunder of merriment. The storm swooped down, enveloped him and the haycock on which he was lying, and the other haycocks and the wagon loads, and the whole meadow and distant fields. All seemed to be shaking and singing to the measures of this wild, merry song, with its shouts and whistles and clapping. Levin felt envious of this health and mirthfulness. He longed to take part in the expression of this joy of life, but he could do nothing and had to lie and look on and listen. When the peasants, with their singing, had vanished out of sight and hearing, a weary feeling of despondency at his own isolation, his physical inactivity, his alienation from the world, came over Levin. Some of the very peasants who had been most active in wrangling with him over the hay, some who he had treated with contumely and who had tried to cheat him, those very peasants had greeted him good-humoredly and evidently were incapable of having any feeling of rancor against him, any regret, any recollection even of having tried to deceive him. All that was drowned in a sea of merry common labor. God gave the day, God gave the strength, and the day and the strength were consecrated to labor, and that labor was in its own reward. For whom the labor, what be its fruits? These were idle considerations beside the point. Often Levin had admired this life, and often he had sense of envy the men who led this life, but today, for the first time, especially under the influence of what he had seen in the attitude of Ivan Parmenov to his young wife, the idea presented itself definitively, definitely, excuse me, definitely to his mind that it was in his power to exchange the dreary article, idle and individualistic life he was leading for this laborious, pure, and socially delightful life. The old man who had been sitting beside him had long ago gone home. The people had all separated. Those who lived near had gone home, while those who came from far were gathered into a group for supper and to spend the night in the meadow. Levin, unobserved by the peasants, still lay on the haycock and still looked on and listened and mused. The peasants who remained for the night in the meadow scarcely slept all the short summer night. At first there was the sound of merry talk and laughing all together over the supper, then singing again and laughter. All the long day of toil had left no trace in them but lightness of heart before the early dawn, all was hushed. Nothing was to be heard but the night sounds of the frogs that never ceased in the marsh, and the horses snoring in the mist that rose over the meadow before the morning. Rousing himself, Levin got up from the haycock, and looking at the stars, he saw that the night was over. Well, what am I going to do? How am I to set about it? He said to himself, trying to express to himself all the thoughts and feelings he had passed through in that brief night. All the thoughts and feelings he had passed through fell into three separate trains of thought. One was the renunciation of his old life, of the utterly useful education. Excuse me. One was the renunciation of his old life, of his utterly useless education. This renunciation gave him satisfaction and was easy and simple. Another series of thoughts and mental images related to the life he longed to live now. The simplicity, the purity, the sanity of this life. He felt clearly, and he was convinced he would find in the content the peace and the dignity of the lack of which he was so miserably conscious. But a third series of ideas turned upon the question how to effect the transition from the old life to the new. And there nothing took clear shape for him. Have a wife, have work and the necessity of work, leave leave Pokrovsko, buy land, become a member of a peasant community, marry a peasant girl. How am I to set about it? He asked himself, and could not find an answer. I haven't slept all night, though, and I can't think it out clearly, he said to himself. And I'll work it out later. One thing's certain. The night has decided my fate. All my old dreams of home life were absurd, not the real thing, he told himself. It's all ever so much simpler and better. How beautiful, he thought, looking at the strange, as it were mother of pearl shell of white fleecy cloudless, resting right over his head in the middle of the sky. How exquisite it all is in the exquisite night. And when was there time for that cloud shell to form? Just now I looked at the sky and there was nothing in it. Only two white streaks. Yes, and at yes, and so imperceptibly too my view of life changed. He went out of the meadow and walked along the high road towards the village. A slight wind arose and the sky looked gray and sullen. The gloomy moment had come that usually preceded the dawn, the full triumph of light over darkness. Shrieking from the cold, Levin walked rapidly, looking at the ground. What's that? Someone coming, he thought, catching the tinkle of bells and lifting his head. 40 paces from him, a carriage with 4 horses, harnessed abreast, was driving towards him along the gray, grassy high road on which he was walking. The shaft horses were tilted against the shafts by the ruts, but the dexterous driver, sitting on the box, held the shaft over the ruts so that the wheels ran on the smooth part of the road. This was all Levin noticed, and without working who it could be, he gazed absently at the coach. In the coach was an old lady dozing in one corner, and at the window, evidently only just awake, sat a young girl holding in both hands the ribbons of a white cap. with a face full of light and thought, full of a subtle, complex inner life. This was remote from Levin. She was gazing beyond him at the glow of the sunrise. At the very instant when the apparition was vanishing, the truthful eyes glanced at him. She recognized him, and her face lighted up with wondering delight. He could not be mistaken. There were no other eyes like those in the world. There was only one creature in the world that could concentrate for him all the brightness and meaning of life. It was she, it was Kitty. He understood that she was driving to Ergoshovo from the railway station, and everything that had been stirring Levin during that sleepless night, all the resolutions he had made, all vanished at once. He recalled with horror his dreams of marrying a peasant girl. There, only in the carriage that had crossed over to the other side of the road and was rapidly disappearing, there only could he find the solution of the riddle of his life which had weighed so agonizingly upon him of late. She did not look out again. The sound of the carriage springs was no longer audible. The bells could scarcely be heard. The barking of dogs showed the carriage had reached the village, and all that was left was the empty fields all around. The village in front, and he himself isolated and apart from it, wandering lonely along the deserted high road. He glanced at the sky, expecting to find there the cloud shell he had been admiring and taking as a symbol of the ideas and feelings of the night. There was nothing in the sky in least like a shell. There, in remote heights above, a mysterious change had been accomplished. There was no trace of shell, and there was stretched over fully half the sky an even cover of tiny and tinier cloudlets. The sky had grown blue and bright, and with the same softness, but the same remoteness, it met his questioning gaze. No, he said to himself, however good that life of simplicity and toil may be, I cannot go back to it. I love her. I need to take a quick minute here. Chapter 13. None but those who were most intimate with Alexei Alexandrovitch knew that, while on the surface the coldest and most reasonable of men, he had one weakness quite opposite to the general trend of his character. Alexei Alexandrovitch could not hear or see a child or a woman crying without being moved. The sight of tears threw him into a state of nervous agitation, and he utterly lost all power of reflection. The chief secretary of his department and his private secretary were aware of this, and used to warn women who came with petitions on no account to give way to tears if they did not want to ruin their chances. He will get angry and will not listen to you, they used to say. And as a fact, in such cases, the emotional disturbance set up in Alexei Alexandrovitch by the sight of tears found expression in hasty anger. I can do nothing. Kindly leave the room, he would commonly cry in such cases. Come on, Chloe, please stop. When returning from the races, Anna had informed him of her relations with Vronsky, and immediately afterwards had burst into tears, hiding her face in her hands. Alexei Alexandrovitch, for all the fury aroused in him against her, was aware at the same time of a rush of that emotional disturbance always produced in him by tears. Conscious of it, and conscious that any expression of his feelings at the minute would be out of keeping with the position, he tried to suppress every manifestation of life in himself, and so neither stirred nor looked at her. This was what had caused that strange expression of death-like rigidity in his face which had so impressed Anna. When they reached the house, he helped her get out of the carriage, and making an effort to master himself, took leave of her with his usual urbanity, and uttered that phrase that bound him to nothing. He said that tomorrow he would let her know his decision. His wife's words, confirming his worst suspicions, had sent a cruel pang to the heart of Alexei Alexandrovitch. That pang was intensified by the strange feeling of physical pity for her set up by her tears. But when he was all alone in the carriage, Alexei Alexandrovitch, to his surprise and delight, felt complete relief both from this pity and from doubts and agonies of jealousy. He experienced the sensations of man who had a tooth out after suffering long from toothache. After a fearful agony and sense of something huge, bigger than the head itself, being torn out of his jaw, the sufferer, hardly able to believe in his own luck, feels all at once that what had so long poisoned his existence and exchanged his attention exists no longer, and that he can live and think again and take interest in other things besides his tooth. This feeling Alexei Alexandrovitch was experiencing. The agony had been strange and terrible, but now it was over. He felt that he could live again and think something other than his wife. No honor, no heart, no religion, a corrupt woman. I always knew it and always saw it, though I tried to deceive myself to spare her, he said to himself. And it actually seemed to him that he always seen it. He recalled incidents of their past life in which he had never seen anything wrong before. Now those incidents proved clearly that she had always been a corrupt woman. I made a mistake in linking my life to hers, but there was nothing wrong in my mistake, and so I cannot be unhappy. It's not I that am to blame, he told himself, but she. But I have nothing to do with her. She does not exist for me. Everything relating to her and her son, towards whom his sentiments were as much changed as towards her, ceased to interest him. The only thing that interested him now was the question of in what way he could best, with most propriety and comfort for himself, and thus with most justice, extricate himself from the mud with which she had spattered him in her fall, and then proceed along his path of active, honorable, and useful existence. I cannot be made unhappy by the fact that a contemptible woman has committed a crime. I have only to find the best way out of the difficult position in which she has placed me, and I shall find it, he said to himself, frowning more and more. I'm not the first nor the last, and to say nothing of hysterical instances dating from the fair Helen of Menelaus, recently revived in the memory of all, a whole list of contemporary examples of husbands with unfaithful wives in the highest society rose before Alexei Alexandrovich's imagination. Daryalov, Poltovsky, Prince Karabanov, Count Paskudin, Dram, yes, even Dram, such an honest, capable fellow. Semyonov, Gagin, Sigognin, Alexei Alexandrovich remembered, admitting that a certain quite irrational ridicule falls to the lot of those men, yet I never saw anything but a misfortune in it, and always felt sympathy for it. Alexei Alexandrovich felt sympathy for misfortunes of the kind, but for the more frequently more highly he had thought of himself. It is a misfortune which may befall anyone, and this misfortune had befallen him. The only thing to be done is to make the best of the position. And he began passing in review the methods of proceeding of men who had been in the same position that he was in. Daryalov fought a duel. The duel had particularly fascinated the thoughts of Alexei Alexandrovich in his youth, just because he was physically a coward and was himself well aware of the fact. Alexei Alexandrovich could not, without horror, contemplate the idea of a pistol aimed at himself, and never made use of any weapons in his life. This horror had in his youth set him pondering on dueling and picturing himself in a position in which he would have to expose his life to danger. Having attained success and an established position in the world, he had long ago forgotten this feeling, but the habitual bent of feeling reasserted itself, and dread of his own cowardice proved even now so strong that Alexei Alexandrovich spent a long while thinking over the question of dueling in all night, in all aspects, and hugging the idea of a duel, though he was fully aware beforehand that he would never, under any circumstances, fight one. There was no doubt our society is still so barbarous. It's not the same in England. That's very many, and among these were those whose opinion Alexei Alexandrovich particularly valued, looked favorably on the duel, but what resulted in it but what result is attained by it? Suppose I call him out, Alexei Alexandrovich went on to himself, and vividly picturing the night he would spend after the challenge, and the pistol aimed at him, he shuddered and knew that he never would do it. Suppose I call him out, suppose I am taught. He went on musing. To shoot. I pressed the trigger, he said to himself, closing his eyes, and it turns out I have killed him. Alexei Alexandrovich said to himself, and he shook his head as though to dispel such silly ideas. What sense is there in murdering a man in order to define one's relation to a guilty wife and son? I should just as much have to decide what I ought to have to do with her. But what is more probable, and what would doubtless occur, I should be killed or wounded. I, the innocent person, should be the victim, killed or wounded. It's even more senseless. But apart from that, a challenge too well that my friends would never allow me to fight duel. Would never allow the life of a statesman needed by Russia to be exposed to danger. Knowing perfectly well beforehand that the matter would never come to real danger, it would amount to my simply trying to gain a certain sham. Sorry, I keep losing my place. Reputation by such a challenge. That would be dishonest. That would be false. That would be deceiving myself and others. A duel is quite irrational, and no one expects it to be. My aim is simply to safeguard my reputation, which is essential for the uninterpreted pursuit of my public duties, official duties, which had always been of great consequence to Alexey Alexandrovich's eyes, seemed of special importance to him. Official duties, which had always been of great consequence in Alexey Alexandrovich's eyes, seemed of special importance to his mind at this moment. Considering and rejecting the duel, Alexey Alexandrovich turned to divorce. Another solution selected by several of the husbands he remembered, passing in mental review all the instances he knew of divorces. There were plenty of them in the very highest society with which he was very familiar. Alexey Alexandrovich could not find a single example in which the object of divorce was that which had in view. In all these instances, the husband had practically ceded or sold his unfaithful wife, and the very party which, being in fault, had not right to contract a fresh marriage, had formed counterfeit pseudo matrimonial ties with the self styled husband. In his own case, Alexey Alexandrovich saw that a legal divorce, that is to say, one in which only the guilty wife would be repudiated, was impossible of attainment. He saw that the complex competitions of the life they led made the coarse proofs of his wife's guilt required by the law out of the question. He saw that a certain refinement in life would not admit of such proofs being brought forward, even if he had them, and that to bring them forward, such proofs would damage him in the public estimation more than it would her. An attempt at divorce could lead to nothing but a public scandal, which would be perfect godsend to his enemies, for calamity for calumny and attacks on his high position in society. His chief object to define that position with the least amount of disturbance possible would not be attained by divorce either. Moreover, in the event of divorce or even of an attempt to obtain a divorce, it was obvious that the wife broke off all relations with the husband and threw in her lot with a lover. And in spite of the complete complete, as he supposed, contempt and indifference he now felt for his wife at the bottom of his heart, Alexey Alexandrovitch still had one feeling in left in the still had one feeling left in regard to her, a disinclination to her to see her free to throw in her lot with Vronsky, so that her crime would be to her advantage. The mere notion of this so exasperated Alexey Alexandrovitch that directly it rose to his mind, he groaned with inward agony and got up and changed his place in the carriage. And for a long while after he sat with scowling brows, wrapping his numbed and bonny legs in the fleecy rug. Apart from formal divorce, one might still do like Karabanov, Paskudin, and that good fellow Dram. That is, separate from one's wife. He went on thinking when he had regained his composure. But this step presented the same drawback of the public scandal as a divorce, and what more, a separation, quiet as much as a regular divorce, flung his wife into the arms of Vronsky. No, it's out of the question, he said against the twisting he said again, twisting his rug about him again. I cannot be unhappy, but neither she nor he ought to be happy. The feeling of jealousy which had tortured him during the period of uncertainty had passed away at the instant when the tooth had been with agony extracted by his wife's words. But that feeling had been replaced by another, the desire not merely that she should not be triumphant, but that she should get due punishment for her crime. He did not acknowledge this feeling, but at the bottom of his heart, he longed for her to suffer for having destroyed his peace of mind, his honor, and going once again over the conditions inseparable from a duel, a divorce, a separation, and once again over the conditions inseparable from a duel, a divorce, a separation, and once again rejecting them. Alexey Alexandrovitch felt convinced that there was only one solution: to keep her with him, concealing what had happened from the world, and using every measure in his power to break off the intrigue, and still more, though this he did not admit to himself, to punish her. I must inform her of my conclusion, and that thinking over the terrible position in which she has placed her family, All other solutions will be worse for both sides than an external status quo, and that such I agree to retain on the strict condition of obedience on her part to my wishes, that is to say, cessation of all intercourse with her lover. When this decision had been finally adopted, another weighty consideration occurred to Alexey Alexandrovitch in support of it. By such a course only shall I be acting in accordance with the dictates of religion, he told himself. In adopting this course, I am not casting off a guilty wife, but giving her a chance of amendment, and not casting off a. Sorry, started to read that again. And indeed, difficult as the task will be to me, I shall devote part of my energies to her reformation and salvation. Though Alexey Alexandrovitch was perfectly aware that he could not exert any moral influence over his wife, that such an attempt at reformation could lead to nothing but falsity, though in passing through these difficult moments, had he not once thought of seeking guidance in his religion, yet now, when his conclusion corresponded, as it seemed to him, with the requirements of religion, this religious sanction to his decision gave him complete satisfaction and to some extent restored his peace of mind. He was pleased to think that even in such an important crisis in life, no one would be able to say that he had not acted in accordance with the principles of that religion whose banner he had always held aloft amid the general coolness and indifference. As he pondered over subsequent developments, Alexey Alexandrovitch did not see, indeed, why his relations with his wife should not remain practically the same as before. No doubt she could never regain his esteem, but there was not, and there could not be any sort of reason that his existence should be troubled, and that he should suffer because she was a bad and faithless wife. Yes, time will pass, time which arranges all things, and the old relations will be reestablished. Alexey Alexandrovitch told himself, so far reestablished, that is, that I shall not be sensible of a break in the continuity of my life. She is bound to be unhappy, but I am not to blame, and so I cannot be unhappy. And that is the end of that chapter. I'm starting to get tired, and that's one reason why my reading is so choppy. But the other reason is just because it's hard to find my place, even though I'm using this to follow along the chapters. Sorry if that was a bit rough starting back, but I am excited to finally get reading more and to find out what is going to happen between Vronsky and Anna Karenina. Have a great evening, and I will be back either later this week or next week with the next reading. I will see you soon.